700 feet. That's how high Lucas hovered over the creek. At least that's what it felt like to him. Swinging clear above a rundown tractor, he didn't even feel the sting of his scraped knee as he rushed through the air. Drawing in his legs, he's forced back and reverse, eyeing the streaming water determinedly through a narrowed gaze. This was it. The day he'd finally jump from his peak height. The swing propelled him forward as he kicked out his legs. It was coming. His moment. But when the swing rushed above the creek, he tightened his grip on the ropes and felt his knees involuntarily bend, assisting his retreat from the water. Disappointed, he allowed his legs to dangle until he came to a stop. Billy Elrod was right. He is a chicken. It's why he wouldn't set the class hamster free and cried when Billy did, tattling so he could put the fat-butt furry creature back in the safety of its cage. Thank Pete that was the last day of school. Lucas spent the past week trying to prove he wasn't really a tattletale and could be just as brave as the rest of the boys, if not braver. He was 7 for crying out loud, and being a scaredy cat was for babies, and he was no baby. He'd show Billy and the rest of them. Next year he'd skip the hamster and set that 5th grade science teacher lady's iguana free. Trudging back to the house, he remembered his bloody knee and tried to wipe it clean, but it had dried and stuck to his skin. He wasn't supposed to be at the creek, and he wasn't a good liar. In the kitchen, his mother cried at the table, and quickly whisked away the tears when she noticed her son. Lucas was glad she was crying. He knew he shouldn't be, but when Mom cried, it meant she didn't notice things like scraped knees. She poured him a glass of sweet tea, and not from one of those short glasses either. The tall glasses were always brought out when she was in one of these moods. Like she thought Lucas wouldn't notice her puffy eyes, but he did. But he also liked the perks too much to allow himself to think too hard on it. From the living room, the TV blared louder than usual, which meant that his dad was angry. But his dad was almost always angry, so it was okay. His dad usually calmed down after his TV shows. Still, Lucas gulped down the tea and slid out the back door. Their backyard extended into a field where weeds grew to Lucas's shoulders. Some even above his head, and wildflowers poked their way through the earth. He liked to pretend it was a jungle. He also wasn't supposed to play in the weeds, but his mom didn't want him playing anywhere fun. Sometimes the weeds irritated his skin, but getting hurt was part of being a boy. At least that's what his dad says when his mom worries about a bruise or a cut. An indistinguishable yell erupted from the house, sending goosebumps down Lucas's neck. He didn't take the time to figure out why before darting into the weeds, hiding with itchy skin until he felt it was safe. When he exited the weeds, he stood in his empty backyard. Though it was summer, he couldn't help but feel a cool emptiness in his chest. Then the most curious thing happened. Dead center in the weeds stood a young girl. Her head barely poked above the tawny bristles. No one was ever in the field, like ever. So it kind of freaked Lucas out, but he stood up straight, like his dad when he saw someone bigger than him in public. "What are you doing in there?" Lucas asked, trying to sound big. The girl watched him for a moment, and then disappeared into the weeds like a swimmer diving underwater. Taking a step back, Lucas's head snapped from left to right. He thought he saw the sway of the weeds, but he also thought he could have imagined it. "Hey, where'd you go?" He was the only one who came back here ever since his dad brought out his shotgun when some older kids were hanging around. His mom said he couldn't do that since the field wasn't technically their property. She shut up real quick when his dad reminded her who the one with the gun was. The slightest movement caught Lucas's eye. The girl sheepishly stepped out of the weeds and turned to remove a piece of brush from her foot. This gave him the perfect view of the back of her head. Her hair was braided, and it reminded him of a mermaid fin, a shiny black mermaid fin. And he thought it was just about the prettiest thing he ever saw. "What were you doing in there?" he asked the girl. She shrugged. "Hiding." "Hiding from what?" he demanded. "I don't know," she said. This frustrated Lucas. "How do you not know what you're hiding from?" "Just don't." She's weird, he thought, but he was bored and wanted someone to play with, even if it was a girl. "What's your name?" he asked. "Shilpa," the girl said. I'm Lucas. Do you live around here? Shilpa pointed her finger at the house. That's where I live, he said, flustered. It's where I live too, she said, nonchalantly. Lucas stared, dumbfounded. You're a liar, he said, and turned away. You sleep in my room, Shilpa said. And this made Lucas turn back to her. The lines by the closet is where my mom used to mark how tall I was. I can show you. My head will come exactly to the last mark. Lucas didn't know how she knew about the markings. They were there before they moved in last year, but for some reason, he believed her. Even so, he shuffled his feet. I'm not allowed to have people in the house, he said. It's okay. No one will see me, Shilpa said, walking toward the house. Her bright yellow shirt seemed so severe in the rays of the summer sun that Lucas thought the blue butterfly in its center might burn to a crisp. My dad'll be real mad, Lucas said. Don't be a chicken. Her words struck him like a slap in the face, so he didn't stop her. They proceeded to the house, and he felt as if he might pee himself as they entered through the kitchen's creaky screen door. His mom was no longer there, and the TV seemed to be even louder than when he left. This is a bad idea, Lucas whispered. But Shilpa moved through the kitchen and down the hall like she knew just where to go. Lucas's knees shook as they neared the living room, the TV's volume growing even louder. And somehow, just as he always did, his father spotted Lucas when he and Shilpa were right in front of the living room just before the stairs. Where have you been? His father asked, angrily. Out back, Lucas whispered. What was that? Speak up, boy. Out back, sir, Lucas forced out over the booming television. Stay away from that tall grass. You know how your mother gets. We don't need a copperhead getting you. Lucas looked at Shilpa, amazed his dad hadn't yelled at the both of them yet. I'd appreciate being looked at when I'm speaking to you. Shilpa shoved her shoulder into Lucas's. Lucas looked back at his father with half astonishment and half satisfaction. Yes, sir. When his father turned his attention back to the large television mounted on the wall, he followed Shilpa up the stairs and into his bedroom as if it wasn't his own house. As soon as the door closed, he said, He really didn't see you. I told you, said Shilpa, walking toward the closet. In the doorframe were tiny lines etched into the wood. Shilpa scooted her back to the wall, and Lucas put his hand flat on her head. With steady precision, he inched his hand from her crown until it met the frame. And he'll be darned, his hand met the last notch. Whoa, you really did live here. I do live here, Shilpa corrected. Why do you keep saying that? He asked. But she didn't answer. Instead, she picked up a soccer ball. They kicked the ball in the backyard, carefree and screaming wildly whenever the other scored a goal in their designated goalpost. For Lucas, it was an old cooler. For Shilpa, between a shovel and a baseball bat. How old are you anyway? Lucas asked, kicking the ball her way. 8. How come you didn't leave when your parents did? And how did you make yourself invisible? Shilpa kicked the ball with a distant look. I didn't get along with my dad. Lucas thought about this. He didn't get along with his dad either. More like his dad didn't get along with him. Lucas kicked the ball, and it shot past Shilpa's makeshift goalpost and into the weeds. Lucas thought about going after it, but the sky was turning dark. My parents didn't like it when I played in the weeds either, Shilpa said, staring into the field. He almost asked the question he dreaded knowing the answer to when his mom turned on the back porch light. But I never got bit by a snake, Shilpa continued. And that was enough for Lucas to decide his parents were just worrying over nothing. He'd retrieve his ball tomorrow, but right now he had to go inside. Laying in the bed later that night, Lucas stared in the direction of the notches in the doorframe. The tiny nightlight plugged into the outlet with its blue plastic race car covering didn't give off much light, so he couldn't actually see the marks. What did Shilpa mean by "you sleep in my room"? Lucas knew it was dumb, but he lifted his head. Shilpa? He called out quietly. And how did she turn invisible? He was pretty sure he knew the answer, but the thought of it freaked him out. A crack surfaced, something his mom referred to as the house settling, and he sat up, expectantly. But he was alone. "So, where are your parents now?" Lucas asked, as he and Shilpa navigated the trees on the way to the swing. "Not sure," Shilpa said. "You never see them?" Lucas asked. He expected to feel sad about it, but he didn't. Shilpa shook her head. "Do you ever miss them?" "I miss my mom," Shilpa said. And even Lucas was smart enough to realize that she didn't mention her dad. "What was she like?" Lucas asked. "She was so pretty. She used to read to me and make chai. Sometimes she'd even kick the ball with me. She braided my hair every night," Shilpa said, touching her braid. Chai. Lucas recognized the word. His mom used to have a friend who would make it when they visited, but they hadn't seen her in a long time. They reached the creek, and the swing hung from a tree with its wooden seat. Sometimes he wished the water was deeper, so he could have one of those standing swings people jump from and into the water like in the movies, but it was just a regular swing, and the water wasn't deep enough. The summer days passed in a sweltering haze. Lucas and Shilpa bonded through dirty palms, record-breaking heights in the swing, and large shared glasses of the sweetest tea his mom ever made. His room doubled as Neverland, where he and Shilpa weren't helpless, lost children, but conniving pirates who took what they pleased. Lucas had found a friend, and the best part of all, he didn't have to share her with anyone, since he was the only one who could see her. The last week of June, Lucas laid in his bed, praying for sleep with his sheets pulled close to his face as his father screamed down the hall. His mother was sorry. For what, he didn't know, but he believed her because she kept saying it over and over. Out of the corner of his eye, Shilpa appeared in front of his closed door, her braids slightly rumpled. He wanted to tell her it wasn't a good time and that his dad wasn't always like this. He was just mad. But Shilpa only stared. But he didn't feel the need to speak, as they watched one another in a silent, painful understanding. A crumbling thud sounded from his parents' room. It was identical to the one made when his dad put a hole in the wall. A few moments later, his mother pleaded for his father to put the gun away. It sent Lucas from his bed and into the closet, tucking himself into the corner, with his legs pulled up and hands covering his ears, making himself as small as possible. But he still heard his father's muffled anger and his mother's cries, harmonizing with his own, until he looked up from his knees. On the other side of the closet, in her own little ball, was Shilpa. "I used to hide here too," she said. Lucas's cries turned to silent streams, as he and Shilpa hid in the closet that was used earlier that very same day as a cell for the kids of Neverland. The following days resumed with no mention of that night. It's amazing the things children can endure, as if they never happened. It continued that way for a few days, until the television blasted yet again, and Lucas caught a glimpse of a handgun on the couch-side table with no sign of his father. Lucas couldn't take his eyes away from the gun. He wanted to hide it, that and the shotgun. If he hid them, maybe his dad would be so distracted searching for them that he'd forget about whatever his mom did to upset him. His thoughts were interrupted by a force striking the back of his head, and he stumbled forward. "You thinking of touching things that don't belong to you?" his father asked, retrieving his gun. Lucas shook his head, unable to speak his typical, "No, sir." His father asked, the gun hanging from his right hand. "No, sir," Lucas said, giving his father the respect he demanded. His dad sighed and put the gun back on the table and nodded toward the door. "Go on, before you piss me off as much as your mom." In the kitchen, Shilpa watched with wide eyes, and Lucas scampered to her. In the field, as they wandered into the weeds, Shilpa said, "We should leave." "What do you mean?" Lucas asked. "Your dad is going to hurt you, just like mine hurt me." "My dad wouldn't hurt me," Lucas said, shoving memories of past encounters with his father deep inside his brain and ignoring that his father had just struck him minutes ago. "Then why was the gun out?" "Sometimes he just likes having it around." Lucas defended his father even though it scared him when the gun was out in the open. It reminded him of the time his dad pointed it at him and his mom and said he'd have a lot more money with them gone after a night of drinking something that always made him yell and hit things. Sometimes those things included Lucas, and almost always included his mom, but Lucas shoved those thoughts aside as well. "Like when he's mad?" Shilpa asked. Lucas stopped walking, pushing grass from his skin. "I'm going home. I don't feel like playing." He turned, leaving Shilpa in the weeds. She knew nothing about him or his dad. Just because she heard one argument didn't make her an expert. June turned to July, and Lucas's loneliness hit an all-time high as he observed kids playing baseball in the park during the trip to the grocery store. He hadn't seen Shilpa since he left her in the weeds 2 days ago, and though his mother didn't know the reason for his melancholy, she was kind enough to stop by the park when she saw his longing. "What about the groceries?" he asked. "The store will be there in an hour," his mother said. And as he stood by the slide, watching the boys with gloves chase after a ball struck by a metal bat, Shilpa appeared beside him. "Why haven't you come looking for me?" she asked, and Lucas nearly jumped out of his own skin. "What are you doing here?" he asked, though he'd be lying if he said he wasn't sort of happy to see her. Her hair was even messier than the last time they saw each other. "I figured you'd come back, but you just left." "I've been back, but you weren't there," Lucas said. "But you didn't want to find me." Lucas rubbed his foot in the sand, unwilling to admit she was right. He had returned to the weeds, that much was true, but he was scared. Though he missed her, he was afraid about how she talked about his dad. He didn't know why it bothered him so much. "I should have went back for you," he admitted. "That's what a brave boy would have done." "Hey, what's that?" Lucas asked, noticing a bruise resembling a handprint around her wrist. "Who are you talking to?" Lucas and Shilpa's heads both snapped in the direction of the young boy who asked the question. He awaited Lucas's answer, wearing a baseball glove and holding an extra in his free hand. "No one," Lucas said quickly. Shilpa shot him a dirty look. "Well, I have an extra glove if you want to play." The boy held out the glove. Lucas reached for it in disbelief. "I'm Lucas." "Drew," the boy said. And Lucas followed him to the field, where he ran and stretched his arm high to catch the flying white ball with red stitching. He wasn't as good at baseball as he was soccer, but he did his best. Some of the boys yelled at him, but Drew didn't seem to mind, and if he did, he was too nice to say so. From time to time, Lucas would glance at the slides to find Shilpa watching silently, but by the time the hour was up, she'd been long gone. Lucas and Drew's moms even exchanged numbers so they could hang out again. By the time Lucas and his mom made it to the grocery store, he was beaming. "You did it again," Shilpa said, after Lucas's return from the store as he pushed her in the swing. "I'm sorry, what was I supposed to do? I didn't want to look weird." Shilpa put her legs down, and her feet dug into the ground, bringing her to a halt. "So, being my friend is weird?" "No, it's just that no one can see you, so it looks like I'm talking to myself." Shilpa looked as if she were considering his words. "I just don't want to be left alone again." Lucas spent most of his summer days with Shilpa, but he also found himself at the park at least once a week to play with Drew. It was always a weekday when his dad was at work. There were only 2 weeks left until school started back. Lucas waited in his room, gazing excitedly out his window. Drew was coming over for a sleepover. He'd never had one or even been to one before, so he didn't know exactly how it worked. What was more shocking was his father allowing it because he heard his parents arguing about it. How his dad had one damn kid to take care of. He didn't need to babysit someone else's. But his mom said he needed friends. He could tell by his dad's tight jaw throughout the day that he didn't like the decision, but Lucas just knew his dad would change his mind once he saw how fun sleepovers could be. Maybe his dad had never had one, because Lucas thought they looked like a blast on TV. "You're going to be in trouble after Drew leaves. You saw how mad your dad was," Shilpa said, playing with a race car on the floor. The bruise on her wrist was even darker than the day in the park, and her braid seemingly felt more out of place with each visit. Lucas tried ignoring her. She said she was trying to help, but it seemed to him like she just wanted to prevent him from having a good time. Shilpa watched throughout the night as Lucas and Drew ate pizza and played video games. Lucas was usually only allowed 2 hours of screen time a day, but his parents let them play as long as they wanted. Every now and again, Shilpa would disappear, and Lucas felt guilty not playing with her. But what was he supposed to do? It's hard to play a 3-person game with the third person in Shilpa's state. He couldn't believe he made 2 friends this summer, and he was afraid the addition of Drew would drive Shilpa away, but Drew was a real, live person. He couldn't just hang out with Shilpa. When Lucas tiptoed down the hall in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, he heard his dad's hushed voice from behind his parents' closed door. He didn't need to hear what he said to know he was unhappy. Regardless, he pushed his ear against the door, hoping he wasn't mad about something he or Drew had done, but the voices stopped. Before Lucas had time to move, he was falling forward, but caught by one of his parents. The strength of the grip told him it was his father before he saw his face. Lucas hated himself for trying to eavesdrop. He could tell by the look in his dad's eyes that he'd made whatever it was 10 times worse. "We'll circle back to this when your friend leaves," his dad said, slamming the door shut. "We have company," Lucas heard his mom say from the other side of the door before making his way to the original destination, the bathroom. After using the bathroom and climbing into the safety of his bed, he was stunned to see Shilpa appear by his door. But she looked different. Sad. Her braid was so disheveled that he wondered how it was even still a braid, and her face was dirty. Before he could ask what happened, she vanished. He ran to the window in hopes he could see her. "What are you looking at?" Drew asked from the air mattress by his bed. Lucas scanned the backyard and moonlit field, and he swore he saw the tall grass sway in the moon's glow. But he did not see Shilpa, and for some reason the weeds he'd spent many days wandering made him feel on edge. The following day, after Drew's mom picked him up, Shilpa returned, hair a mess like the night before. In the daylight, Lucas saw that her clothes were dirty, and there was a tear in her sleeve. "What happened to you?" Lucas asked. But Shilpa wasn't listening. From the kitchen, Lucas's dad complained about the amount of soda the boys had gone through the night before. He was always upset about money, especially in August when the start of the school year was approaching. Lucas and Shilpa returned to the swing by the creek, but Shilpa didn't seem like herself. She was quieter, and Lucas got the distinct feeling that she was planning something. "Have you ever been to India?" Shilpa asked. Lucas shook his head. "That's where my parents are from." Lucas recalled now that's where his mom's friend was from who used to make chai. "We should go," Shilpa said. Lucas kicked out his legs. "How would we get there?" "A plane," she said. "I don't think my parents would let me." "You don't have to tell them," Shilpa said, and Lucas understood. She didn't want them to visit, she wanted them to run away. "I don't want to leave my parents," he said. "You should," Shilpa said with an anger that scared him on the level of his father's. He stopped swinging. "Can we just play like we used to?" he asked. But after he asked, he noticed a small drop hit the ground by Shilpa's foot. It was thick and red like blood. He looked at her in a panic, but she didn't appear hurt. Without a notice, Shilpa soundlessly departed, leaving Lucas dangling on the splintered swing. Returning to his home, Lucas felt the tightness of the air as he walked through the kitchen door. His father was the one at the table this time, and he froze, as if an animal caught in a trap. His father observed him, and it reminded Lucas of the supervillains before they gave their big speech. "You've been at the creek," his father said. It wasn't a question. "No, sir," Lucas said automatically. His father stared with a look unfamiliar to Lucas before saying, "Next time you slink off in that direction, be a bit sneakier about it. I don't want to take away from your fun, but I also don't feel like arguing with your mother today." He tipped his head with a smile and raised eyebrows. Shilpa appeared beside his father with pleading eyes. She looked just as ruffled as before. For the first time, he wanted to tell her to go away. Bringing his attention back to his father, Lucas didn't know if it was a trap, so he defaulted to the usual, "Yes, sir," and went up to his room. There was something off about his dad earlier. The screaming down the hall confirmed it, though Lucas didn't understand. His father said he didn't want to argue with his mom, but he should have known because usually when he says that, the worst arguments tend to follow. Sometimes these fights left Lucas crying in the closet. Other times, like today, he somehow drowned out the words until the yelling became a distant sound, like the hard-to-decipher conversations through can-made walkie-talkies. Unfortunately, this blessing of a skill was interrupted by Shilpa, once again at his door. But this time, the sight of her had him jumping from the floor, knocking over the log cabin he'd been constructing with Lincoln logs. Shilpa's braid had come undone, and her hair was a ratted mess. The dirt on her face was mixed with sticky blood that had strands of hair caught in it. Her eyes welled with enough water to make them flow straight from her skull, and Lucas noticed a pool at her feet. Blood. He screamed, and Shilpa took one step forward. "You have to leave," she pleaded, taking another step toward Lucas. He backed himself against the windowsill, shaking with a ferocity he had never known as the summer sun heated his back. "Lucas," Shilpa said through a fractured sob and took a step forward. "Leave me alone," Lucas screamed as he sidestepped, unable to back up any further. Down the hall, his parents' door opened with a bang. "What did you say?" His father's voice rattled his insides. "Don't think I've forgotten about you." "Leave him be," his mother cried. Lucas heard the footsteps cease as his mother and father continued their argument in the hall. "Run," Shilpa said, urgently. Terror-stricken, Lucas pushed himself from the windowsill and past Shilpa, through the door. His parents stood in the middle of the hall and his father waved his favorite steel threat, causing his mother to crumble against the wall in a fit of tears with her hands shielding her head. His father caught sight of him. For a split second, his mom uncovered her head to see her son. Then his father took a step forward, and Lucas darted down the stairs, through the hallway and kitchen and out the back door. All the while, his dad screamed from upstairs. Headed straight for the weeds, Lucas ran for what he felt his life. He ran and ran and ran, leaving behind his mother and father and Shilpa in that treacherous house of haunted memories. At some point, his parents had come outside. The humidity left him gasping for air after his sprint from the house. He carefully pushed aside the weeds and watched his father disappearing in the direction of the creek, yelling his name. "Lucas!" his mother barely croaked out. "Lucas, you know he won't actually use the gun, sweetie. Come back home." With no sign of Lucas, she turned back to the house, giving up the fight. Backing further into the weeds, his breath caught when his back hit something. Someone. For a moment, he thought it was his father, but when he turned, he found Shilpa, and a gasped cry escaped his mouth as he fled to the right, pushing the scratchy grass away from his face as he continued to run, changing course when he'd catch a glimpse of the frightening girl he used to consider a friend. Looking back, he thought he finally got rid of her when his foot caught on something, sending him crashing to the ground. He let out a howl as he pulled his ankle toward him. He had twisted it. Then a fresh scream clawed its way from his throat, and it sent him crawling back, forcing himself up on his throbbing, hurt ankle. On the ground lay a corpse, skin completely gone, and the white bones were corrupted with dirt, leaving them tarnished. The clothes wrapping the bones had faded and turned into a dirty mess. Lucas screamed again and noticed beyond the dirt and decay there was a yellow shirt with a butterfly in the center, the same one as Shilpa's. Lucas turned to run. Upon his turn, he was met with Shilpa, as clean and pretty as the day they met. He and Shilpa stared into one another, the heavy fever of August upon them, and the weight of fear crushing their lungs as Lucas's father yelled in the distance, the air carrying his anger like a bullet.